Hello, everyone. Welcome to this beautiful evening in New York City at the Columbia University Weatherhead East Asian Institute. My name is Qing Gao. I'm a professor at the Columbia University School of Social Work and also Weatherhead East Asian Institute. I also direct the China Center for Social Policy here, which the center is a co-sponsor of today's event. Thank you so much for being here. I think we are gathered together to talk about a very important topic. And our guest speaker is Dr. Ross Dahl, who is a lecturer at the Blum Center for Developing Economies at the University of California, Berkeley, UC-Berkeley. So thank you for flying all the way to the East Coast to join us. We just had a nice chat. We had some shared experiences. I think in the early 2000s, you went to China and I came to the United States. And it's amazing that we get to meet here today to learn about your research and have a discussion. I have to introduce my esteemed colleague, Dr. Nick Smith, who is an assistant professor of urban planning or urban studies at Barnard College. He has a recent book, The End of the Village, Planning the Urbanization of Rural China, which is fascinating. Nick will be the discussant after Ross's presentation. So the presentation is titled Left to Live and Die, yes, Resource Security and the Biopolitics of Land Stockpiling in China. I've read the paper, it's fascinating, a lot of rich material in it, and we are very eager to learn from your findings. For the audience, after the presentation and discussion, we invite you to raise questions. When you do, please get a mic and speak to the mic. Thank you so much. Ross, please.
First of all, thank you all so much for being here. It's amazing. What an honor to have this chance What an honor to have this chance to come here and to meet you all and to see old friends, and it's incredible. And thank you, Jin, for that incredible introduction, and thank you to Nick for the invitation. Thank you to the Weatherhead Institute for this opportunity. Again, it's an honor and a privilege to be here. And thank you all for being here, for coming out. I'm going to say at the start that this paper is so complicated, even for me, that I'm going to have to do a lot of reading from a page, and I'm going to apologize in advance for having to do that, because if I don't do that, I cannot possibly keep all of this in my own head. So anyway, I'm going to do my best to keep it more engaging than just reading off a piece of paper, but I'm going to have to do a lot of reading. So, a little bit of background on me. Well, first of all, let me share my slides. One more time. Got it. Okay, we're good? Okay. So as Chin mentioned, my talk today is called Left to Live and Die, Resource Security and the Biopolitics of Land Stockpiling in China. Just a very light topic for our Thursday evening. Okay, so bit of background on me. I'm a human geographer, and I study relationships between development and environmental policy, governance and agrarian change, and their influence on sustainability. And in this work, I foreground subjectivity formation. And I'm interested in how historical policies come to ground to influence everyday practices and encounters, how these practices, encounters, and That's okay. Oh, yeah. Thank you. Okay, great, thank you. So I'm interested in how everyday, how policies and how historical policies come to ground to influence everyday practices, and how those practices and encounters in turn inform notions of belonging, identity, and political possibility, and then the implications of all of that for how resources are used. Okay, there we go. To study these relationships, I draw on these three fields: cultural geography, political ecology, and critical agrarian studies. So for this talk, I'll begin by introducing my field site and methods. I'll then introduce the agricultural modernization policy, the research question, and my argument. And I'll then discuss my theoretical framing before presenting my empirical research. And I'll conclude with thoughts about implications of this research for studies of resource use and sustainability. So this talk is based on an article that was published last fall in Antipode. It's also a chapter in the book manuscript that I'm preparing, which is titled "On Broken Ground: The Politics and Precarity, the Politics of Precarity and Belonging in Rural China." The book examines historical, political, ecological, and cultural intersecting processes shaping and the consequences of the Chinese state's ongoing agricultural modernization drive. And the book asks these three questions. What explains spatiotemporal variation in villagers' responses to agricultural modernization? Why have states supported large-scale farmers struggled financially? And what do these outcomes suggest about the future of farming in China? So this book is an ethnography of a place that I call Ruilin Township. And Ruilin is about 4 hours overland from Shanghai to the west in Anhui province. And I should mention that all of the places in this study that are below the municipal level, I'm using aliases for these, pseudonyms. And I'm anonymizing my study this way in response to a few things. This is just sort of standard practice among people who study in this particular site. It's also in response to the requests of my informants. So this is Ruilin Township, and it's situated on a polder area here in between the Kui River to the east and the Tang Mountains to the west. Ruilin is relatively remote. It lies about 20 kilometers from the county seat, which is called Yangchun, and this will come up in the talk. I'll talk a lot about Yangchun County. And about 50 kilometers from the municipal seat. And Ruilin has 13 administrative villages that are listed here. It has a population of 30,000. Ruilin's territory is primarily farmland. Outside of mountains and lakes, half of the land in Ruilin is arable. So the book is based on 12 months of ethnographic research that I conducted in 2014, 2017, and 2018. During that time, I conducted 220 interviews with villagers, large-scale farmers, those who are working in the processing of grain and rice and wheat, farmers of different kinds, large-scale farmers, small-scale farmers, migrants, suppliers, suppliers of inputs and outputs. And this was all very, required a lot of car rides and a lot of, being sort of forced and challenged to drink a lot of baijiu and just really a lot of pain and suffering. It was a common thing among the officials in my township to challenge me to drinking competitions, not because I asked for it, not because I had showed any interest, but because it was like, can we be better than this white American? And can we, sort of, yeah, anyway. But also, it's a friendly thing too. It's inviting me to participate, but sometimes it didn't always seem so friendly. Anyway, but a lot of pain, but all for the good. So I also undertook a participant observation of farming practices, household production, and village life. I also did sketch mapping, archival materials, drew on those and secondary sources. So I was interested in studying railene because in 2007, it became one of the first places, I should say 2008, it became one of the first places to receive funding from the state for the purposes of agricultural modernization. In 2007, it started using its own resources to this end, and then it got funding in 2008. And agricultural modernization, it's something that has not received very much attention here in the US, or even probably sufficient attention in China, but it's really extraordinary in its implications. So the Chinese state has proposed to render all grain farming in the country both large scale and mechanized by 2035. And it's devoted vast sums of money to accomplishing this goal. So between 2013 and 2015, 2013 and 2020, it spent $500 billion US on this project. This project being things like consolidating land, leveling it, grading it, making it possible for tractors, different kinds of equipment to be able to work this land more efficiently and effectively. I should mention that most of that money, it's gone to, again, things like these redevelopment projects, but it's also gone to things like subsidies for large-scale farmers. So to this end, also for agricultural modernization, the state has reformed its land laws to make it more possible for land to be consolidated and then to be converted into uses, again, that are more friendly for agricultural mechanization. I'll back up here and I'll say that under the new laws, collectives can, with 2/3 agreement of the collective, okay, I have to back up even further, to remind ourselves, for those who have forgotten or maybe are not familiar, that rural land in China is owned by collectives who grant use rights to household members on 30-year contracts. But under the new laws, with a 2/3 agreement of the collective members, the collectives can transfer their land to individuals and companies that are not collective members. So given that some 600 million people, this of course is really hard to estimate, but this is the best I can come up with, most of them small-scale household farmers continue to rely on agriculture for some part of their livelihoods. This represents a massive change on so many different levels in the country, in China. Economic, social, cultural, so many different things. So by the time I arrived in Railin Township in 2014, this place was already fairly well known among people in China who are interested in rural development questions. And it was well known not only because places like Railin and Yangchun were trailblazers in all of this, but it was well known because they were considered to have been successful. When I say they, Railin Township and Yangchun County were considered to be successful in this initiative. They were considered in some respects to be models of what other people in China should do, they should follow this example of what they did. So what do I mean when I say that they were successful, considered successful by the state? So when Railin officials began modernizing the township in 2007, there were 9,000 rice-growing households that farmed all of Railin's 2,000 hectares on these very small land holdings, about 0.5 hectares, or 6.5 mu. Only 7 years later, by 2014, when I arrived in Railin, 60% of Railin's land had been modernized, and 67 large-scale farmers with holdings of about 27 hectares were leasing 53% of that land on 5-year contracts. And they were growing primarily rice and wheat. Whereas the previous farmers were growing just rice, these new farmers were trying to grow two crops a year. And we can see the change that occurred in Railin. It's representative in these satellite images that I have here. So these images are of Ding Village, which is in Railin, sort of north-central area. So land development projects began in Ding in 2014, and only 6 months later, what had been the sort of patchwork series of plots that we can see here on the left image had been turned into these more sort of regimented grids that we see on the right side. These rationalized grids. So it took only about 6 months for this change that we see represented in these photos to happen. So by 2014, results like these had earned Railin and Yangchun officials a series of awards and rewards. Yangchun and Railin leaders were promoted to roles within the county and provincial government. And in 2013, the township was named a provincial-level agricultural modernization demonstration zone. And this distinction earned it priority funding status, but also frequent visits from officials from not only around the province, but around the country. And these officials came to visit to learn from the example of the officials, to learn what their techniques and tricks and strategies were in order to export these models to other places. And so not coincidentally, given these results, given these circumstances, the rest of Railin, or the rest of China quickly came to seem more and more like Railin. So between 2007 and 2017, China's consolidated arable land area increased this amount from 5 to 37%. And we can see these changes, again, in rural areas all around the country, where this switch has happened from, again, these sort of more, this patchwork kind of series of land uses to more of these kind of regimented grids that are more hospitable to industrialized agriculture. So at first glance, the Chinese state's embrace of agricultural modernization, it appears driven by a desire to dismantle the socialist collective economy and open the countryside to capitalist agriculture. And from the perspective of classical development theory, states privatize and invest in this high efficiency and high productive agriculture, such as what we see in Railin, in response to the demands of their people for the comforts and ease of urban life. From a Marxist perspective, states liberalize policies and rationalize the use of force. States liberalize laws and policies in order to rationalize the use of force, needed to allow for things like dispossession, resource accumulation, and labor exploitation. Using such lenses, popular and scholarly literature on China's agricultural modernization has tended to view the state's reforms as largely motivated, again, by this desire to expand capitalist agriculture. So we see that represented in this article here from the New York Times in 2018, where the author's point of view is exactly this, that the state has opened up land, liberalized land laws in order to increase opportunities and also to give, not only increase opportunities for large-scale farmers to make money from farming, but also to increase opportunities for small-scale farmers to lease their land, make money from that rent, and move to the cities. So these theories in this work, they also informed my own expectations of what I was going to find in Railin when I showed up in 2014. I expected that I would find exactly what was sort of envisioned by, again, classic modernist theory as well as Marxist theories. I expected that I would find a kind of a black and white sort of picture where we had large-scale farmers who were kind of in collusion in a certain sense with local government to make a lot of money, and that there was a sort of good and a bad to this picture. We had the good guys who were the small-scale farmers who were fighting in order to save their land, and they were fighting against these large-scale farmers who were, and again, in collusion with the local government to push them off the land and take advantage of their resources and dispossess them and ultimately exploit them, this kind of thing. This is what I expected to find, this very black and white kind of picture. So I was surprised then to find over the course of my research that most of the large-scale farmers then and now were struggling and are struggling. So among those that began leasing their land between 2009 and 2011, and keep in mind, this is in the immediate aftermath of when this policy was introduced. These should be the good days. Only 20% renewed their leases and 30% abandoned their leases early. And as these large-scale farmers, who are called dahu, which I'll introduce that term a little bit later, as they struggled and departed, large-scale farmers, especially those that leased more than 800 mu, or 27 hectares, they fallowed sections or even the entirety of their farms. And furthermore, their struggles, I found, increased over time. So when I came back to Raylene, what I call Raylene in 2017 and 2018, 90% of Raylene large-scale farmers had either lost money or broke even at that time, and they left 15% of the township's arable land fallow for at least half of the year. So what's going on here? This seems strange. Why have Raylene's large-scale commercial farmers struggled despite all of this state support? This is not what's supposed to happen. And maybe even more strangely, why has the broader state interpreted what seems like a failure? Why has it been interpreted as a success? Why have Raylene officials been rewarded when what seems to be their goal has in fact not been accomplished? Here's my argument. Yeah, this gets a little complex. Hang with me here. I argue that China's large-scale farmers have financially struggled because financial success for the large-scale farmers was never really the primary goal of the government with the agricultural modernization policy. Rather, the state sought to expand capitalist agricultural opportunities. That was part of their motivation. But they also sought to create the infrastructure necessary to buffer disturbances in global food supply chains upon which the state had come to rely and from which it cannot extricate itself. Let me say a little bit more about what I mean by that. Okay, so in response to what, we have to go back in history a little bit to the late 70s, early 80s, briefly. In response to what the state perceived as a legitimacy crisis, it undertook a series of liberalizing reforms in the 80s, which most of us are familiar with, including fiscal decentralization and decollectivization. These reforms, skipping ahead in time, set the stage for the 90s adoption of the state of export manufacturing as a development model. This model depended on the urbanization of rural labor and also officials' ability to expropriate rural land at cheap costs for development. The state's 2001 entry into the WTO, it eased some of these pressures that were put on the system by virtue of the loss of rural labor, as well as the loss of rural land in the state's capacity to be able to feed itself. We saw at this point declines in domestic production, and China became a net food importer at this time. However, the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008 exposed the kind of flaws in this system. It showed how vulnerable global supply chains are. So what I argue is that modernization stems in large part from, it's a response from the state to this kind of quandary they're in. State leaders recognized the need for a secure domestic agricultural base, but they were also caught in a bind. The reliance on export manufacturing and cheap land meant that they couldn't transition to a domestic agricultural production model without violating WTO rules, World Trade Organization rules on protectionist trade tariffs. Nor could it really demand, if it wanted to maintain its economic model, that urban governments stop requisitioning arable land for new developments. So rather, with agricultural modernization, the state sought to create a kind of balance or a compromise between these two competing goals, food production and economic development. So it created a agricultural modernization system, a food production system, domestic system, able to complement and compensate for disruption to imports. And we can see some of this reflected, some of this desire to find a kind of balance in this quote from Wen Jiabao from 2008. This is from his report on the work of the government. So he basically, as I interpret it, he says, the goal of agricultural modernization is not to solve the problem of the state's over-reliance on vulnerable grain imports by replacing imports with domestically produced grain. Rather, agricultural modernization was necessary in part because China must be fully prepared to respond to changes in the international environment and improve our ability to prevent risks, including risks to rising international grain prices. To this end, the state must enhance the country's overall grain production capacity and become more able to ensure adequate supplies. The state must strengthen its agricultural foundation because China must prepare for danger in times of peace. So under these circumstances, the state wanted this very quick kind of action in order to secure its production capacity, to make sure that it had a fallback, a food security fallback if things went awry again in global supply chains. So the state, but again, in order to sort of seek this balance, what the state did is it enacted modernization not by using sort of demand-driven reforms to create a thriving market for large-scale farmers, because it couldn't really do that. It couldn't extricate itself from the WTO. But instead by expanding the capacity and incentives for urban governments to intervene in rural areas and to place pressure on rural officials to undertake agricultural modernization. So to this end, the state did a few things. It transferred an increased amount of power, administrative power, and budgetary oversight from rural areas to urban areas. It also took advantage of some changes that had been made in the 90s and also the mid-2000s with the change in land policies and tax laws that encouraged urban governments to do more expropriation of land and selling that land to companies to get a profit. There was an incentive built into this 1995 law change, and where governments started to use this to fill in gaps in their own budgets. And also the end of the 2006 end to the agricultural tax. Both of these things, the tax created this vacuum, this space that needed to be filled in budgets. And what the state did is it created incentives for urban governments to pursue modernization by providing these direct funding project awards. So under these circumstances with no agricultural tax, these urban governments and rural governments were suddenly placed in this bind where they needed to find something to fill that gap. And this funding for modernization helped to fill that gap. So they needed to pursue that money. And then lastly, the state, to protect national arable land shares from expropriation and development, the state in 2008 announced a national arable land red line policy. This required the state to maintain a minimum of 1.8 billion mu of arable land. But this is kind of how to explain this, like a cap and trade system a little bit. You can see this. By stipulating that governments must compensate for lost arable land by, we can say, freeing up equal shares of arable land within their jurisdictions, the state's policy allowed overseeing governments to maintain their lucrative land development practices. So what this means is that in urban governments, they can develop land, arable land, designated as arable land around their vicinities, but in order to do so, they have to find a comparable share of land somewhere else in their jurisdiction to take the place of that land. So this is what this red line policy is allowing them to do. And what it encourages is this kind of like creating of land banks in places like Rayleigh. So the overseeing municipality, they need to keep developing that land in order to make money, but what they have to do is start to be more in conversation and in dialogue with governments like in Rayleigh in order to make sure, in order to create these sort of pools of land that allow them again to continue with their development of urban land. So if we see it in this way, what I argue is that what we're looking at when we look at this image of Ding Village, which we return to here from 2017, it is commercialized farms. We're looking at commercialized farms here on the right side. But I argue that we're also looking at an arable land stockpile, or what Andreas Falkers calls reservoirs of frozen time. This is a new kind of stockpile. Rapidly and broadly recreating hybrid farm stockpiles in this way, which the state is trying to do, came at a great cost. The land development projects undertaken by rural governments were often designed and undertaken under these circumstances without consideration for their place-based feasibility. Again, we're thinking about all this pressure on urban governments to create these spaces. What matters more to them is to create spaces in order to get funding and to create these kind of land banks in order to continue their urban development schemes. They don't really care so much, I argue, about whether or not these situations actually work. And I'm going to argue that agricultural modernization did not work and does not work in Raylene Township. In the absence of the potential demand push for which the state ushered them in, that is to say, in the absence of any demand to actually produce large amounts of grain for the domestic population, large-scale farmers in these situations found themselves producing grain for little market. This is because grain imports were often cheaper and are often cheaper and considered of better quality by domestic consumers. And finally, under these circumstances, given how little money these large-scale farmers were making, and given that the incentives to do this are really coming from the top down, there were really very few incentives for rural officials in places like Raylene to step in and really try to do more to assist these farmers in succeeding. Basically, their initiative, their incentive was just to get the farmers in place. And they didn't particularly care, well, they cared a little bit, but they didn't particularly care about what happened once they got there, is what I'm going to argue. So agricultural modernization is a product, I would say, of a constrained state. And it is for this reason that, as the head of Raylene's Agricultural Extension Office told me, large-scale farmers have been left to live and die. And it is also for this reason that large-scale farmers' struggles went unnoticed or did not influence the state's glowing appraisals of the Raylene and Yangchun government's work. Okay, so a little bit of background on theory. I'm going to try to make this as quick and painless as possible, because it is. Foucault is a lot. Okay, so in my analysis, I draw on Foucauldian biopolitics and resource security literature. This work argues that the kinds of compromises, trade-offs, and sacrifices the Chinese state made with agricultural modernization and the economic and resource waste, I would call it waste, that resulted, are common to late modernist states. Modernist states differ from sovereign states in that they gain their legitimacy not through their ability to use force to secure themselves, but through their ability to apply rational science-based governance techniques and technologies to enhance and secure economic productivity, population health, and military strength. How do they do this? Modernist states, they analyze historical data to identify predictable social problems, such as economic downturns and layoffs, endemic diseases, droughts, floods, things like this, crime. They then use this information to design and build what Stephen Collier and Andrew Lakoff refer to as population security apparatuses. These apparatuses are meant to reduce the occurrence of these problems and their harms. In this respect, this theory suggests that the work of securing is, somewhat counterintuitively, the work of securing is necessary for the maintenance of capitalist flow. When we think about things like investment, productivity, and efficiency, we need to have security in order to ensure flow. However, the interlinked and systemic nature of modernist governance techniques means that they are also highly vulnerable to disruption. Given the critical role these techniques play in maintaining modernist states' social stability and economies, such disruptions are potentially catastrophic. Modernist states respond to the potential for disruptions to their population security apparatuses with new apparatuses, bigger apparatuses. And Collier and Lakoff refer to these new apparatuses that are intended to buffer the possible breakdown of the initial apparatuses as vital systems security. And we can think about this as kind of, a lot of this history starts with states' interest in trying to compensate or think ahead, buffer the potential disturbances of nuclear war. So in post-World War II, like what would this mean? And trying to come up with kinds of redundant infrastructures, things like this, to account for this possibility of the potential for nuclear war. What would you do? These are unprecedented kinds of disasters. So the threats to which modernist states are responding and attempting to prepare for are often unprecedented in nature. For this reason, vital system security relies on disaster modeling to create these vast, passive, and ongoing security apparatuses. You can think about underground bunkers and things like this that were never actually used. Not quite ready yet. So the vital system security, they often take the form of things like stockpiles, vital industrial facilities, communications networks, aquifers, flood control reservoirs, and standby production lines. However, what Collier and Lakoff argue is that vital system security creates itself even more problems. It's a solution to a problem that creates even more problems. It rationalizes new forms of self-destructive harm and waste. To secure the territory needed for these new infrastructures, these vast new infrastructures, states enfold rural areas into the political domains of hierarchically superior urban governments. And under these circumstances, these rural areas become themselves redundant and politically subservient urban appendages. In this sense, far from purely anticipatory or neutral, vital system security techniques are an instrument with the indirect effect of broadening state authority over rural areas. Under these circumstances, rural spaces are no longer managed with the primary aim of effectively serving their own inhabitants or their own ecologies. And as a final theoretical note, I promise I'll stop talking about Foucault so directly after this, and we'll get to the empirics, which we're all more interested in. But this is actually, will come up later. So, and I can't really explain the title if I don't do this part. All right. According to Foucault, modernist states also produce harm through an unavoidable condition within the use of scientific rationalism to create technologies and techniques that optimize extraction, production, and efficiency. So there's a sort of unavoidable effect of using these rational techniques to achieve these aims. Using these technologies to create these outcomes leads to overproduction, dispossession, labor redundancy, and resource contamination. And further, these effects are felt unevenly across spatial and class lines. They disproportionately affect rural areas and unskilled labor populations. But modernist states have a kind of workaround for this kind of thing. They respond to this problem by dismissing the harms that they cause by the use of these kinds of techniques via their own sort of self-justifying logics. Modernist states frame their rational science-based governance techniques as advancing natural, evolutionistic, and apolitical processes. So what they say is, the intention of these kinds of policies is to improve health, it's to improve wealth, to improve efficiency, productivity. These are all natural kinds of processes. So, and they ultimately benefit the common good. So this is the kind of logic they refer to when they say that, yeah, these might produce harms, but there's nothing we can do about it. We're just trying to advance what would happen anyway. What is either sort of inevitable or is necessary. Thus, to the extent that these techniques result in the concentration of benefits to some races, classes, or spaces at the expense of others, or result in the suffering and death of the excluded, the state and the actors who compose it can rationalize these outcomes as inevitable, outside their ability to change, or necessary for the advancement of the species. Through this internal logic of the modernist state endows itself and is endowed by the population, not with the power to take life and let live, but as Foucault says, the power to make live and let die. Letting die includes every form of indirect murder, the fact of exposing someone to death, increasing the risk of death for some people, or quite simply, political death, expulsion, rejection, and so on. Okay, end of Foucault. All right, my contribution. How does this paper contribute to theories of agrarian change? It contributes to theories of agrarian change and particularly the role of the state in agrarian change. So research on sort of using theories related to the work of Karl Polanyi, they argue that unlike Marxist theories, states are not just weak or they don't just work in collusion with capital in order to expand capitalist interests and aims. Rather, states are the ultimate arbiters of power. And they are concerned not just with economic expansion and productivity, but also with the security and the stability of their population. So they're concerned with protecting their societies from the harms that the expansion of population might cause, the expansion of capitalism might cause. Things like the aforementioned dispossession, exploitation, landlessness, things like this. So from the Polanyian perspective, states will intervene to rein in capitalism when its expansion threatens social stability. And indeed, the Chinese state often does just this. But a Polanyian point of view, in my opinion, it would suggest that at moments when the state disembeds, such as in 2008, 2009, 2010, when the state so enthusiastically supports things like agricultural modernization, that should be the time in which large-scale farmers are most ascendant, they're wealth producing, most successful in economic terms. But that's not what we found in Raylene. Rather, large-scale farmers were consistently struggling, whether it was in this moment right after the state so-called disembedded and supported capital, or in later moments when it was supposed to have sort of been re-embedding itself and reining in capital. No matter when it happened, large-scale farmers struggled. So I don't think it quite explains what's happening here, this theory. A Foucauldian and resource security lens suggests that states don't just move in these kinds of consistent and repeating ebb and flow cycles from embedding and disembedding. Rather, for modernist states, the nature of their governance techniques creates path dependencies that compromise and limit the state's power. So from this perspective, states are not in control. Rather, they are controlled by their own techniques. They are controlled by their own need to maintain an inherently vulnerable system that becomes only more vulnerable over time. So under these kind of late modernist conditions, states use rural areas not just as sacrifice zones, which is a common kind of parlance. Rather, I would suggest that increasingly they become these kinds of stockpile areas. They're managed in part through the lens of urban governments concerned not with the present, but with the potential future rendered unstable by fragile modernist infrastructures. But unlike traditional stockpiles of gold, vaccines, or food, rendering a source of production a stockpile means by definition rendering secondary the present concerns of inhabitants. So this work challenges work that ultimately challenges this sort of common theme in agrarian change literature that says that if, let's say, land expropriation or large-scale land grabs happen around the world, it doesn't matter whether or not those large-scale land grabs are enacted by, say, a company, an enterprise, by capital, or if they're enacted by states. What this theory suggests is that potentially states have very different kinds of roles and interests and motivations for doing this kind of work. And by virtue of those different roles and motivations, the effects on farmers in those areas will be very different. The large-scale farmers that might succeed under a kind of more capitalist-driven situation might find themselves struggling under this kind of more, again, vital system security sort of condition. Okay, so now I'll move on to talking about my research findings. And yes, there's a reason why this picture is so blurry. I did it on purpose. I hope I'm not hurting your eyes, but it's to try to maintain some level of anonymity for the place. Okay, so my empirical findings. We talk about Raylene. We talk about how what I've just described unfolded in Raylene and how in many ways the dynamics that I've just discussed are represented in my fieldwork and in this place. Okay, so a story here. The liberalizing economic reforms that happened in the 1980s, these were kind of terrible news for people who worked in places like this. And this is the Yangchun County government building. So Yangqing County's deputy head, his name is Fang Jingwei, at least that's what I'm calling him, was responsible under China's decentralized administrative system for meeting his own government's fiscal requirements, as well as ensuring the effective operations of the places like Raylene under his umbrella. For Fang, agricultural townships like Raylene were little more than financial albatrosses. They were too remote to act as cost-effective sites of industry, and for this reason, Raylene's government was dependent on the agricultural tax overwhelmingly for its budget, about 30% of its annual revenue. So for Fang, when the agricultural tax was eliminated in 2006, this created a huge problem because suddenly he had to find a way to fill this agricultural gap, this tax gap. It was a disaster. So desperate for a way to make up the lost revenue from railing, Fang and his subordinates, they scanned state policy and media reports for solutions. What do we do about this? Central leaders had long advocated for the creation of professional cooperatives and vertical integration agribusinesses to offer agricultural producers upstream and downstream services. But in 2006 and 2007, those central leaders for the first time are called, albeit vaguely, for rural governments to consolidate, scale up, and mechanize agricultural production itself. So we're talking about a fundamental change. We're not just talking about agribusinesses that work, again, upstream or downstream from production, but we're talking about agribusinesses to take over production. Fang gambled, this is, again, Fang Jingui, the deputy head of Yangchun County. He gambled that if Yangchun County proactively initiated such reforms, that is agricultural modernization, turning agricultural production from small-scale farmers to large-scale farmers, he gambled that if he did so, leaders might be, he and other leaders of the county, they might be rewarded financially and professionally for their innovation, their innovative development and environmental conservation work. I turned off my phone. That is really weird. It's because my wife is calling me and she can bypass mine. Hopefully everything's okay.
As she should be able to.
Yes, she should be able to, yes. We have a 5-month-old too, so that's, okay. Anyway, let's hope everything's okay. Okay. And I'll keep talking about Foucault. What really matters here. Okay. So recognition for this work. So Fang was thinking that if he does this work, not only might it pay off financially, but also it might give him some cover for the kinds of things that he wasn't supposed to be doing. So this government is primarily dependent upon things like cement manufacturing, which creates tons of pollution. And this was becoming more and more of a problem around this time. And Fang gambled that doing things like agricultural modernization, development work, and railing would help to provide a kind of cover for that work. So to this end, Yangchun County officials, they coordinated with railing officials on a preliminary site to undertake this agricultural modernization initiative. And they coordinated with an urban planning firm to create, in the municipal capital, to create these land development schemes, such as in this map I'm showing you here. So for Fang, at this point in his thinking, he thought that the bigger he can make these farms, the better. He interpreted the central government as saying these farms should be as large as possible and look as much, in a sense, like American large-scale farms. That was really kind of what he imagined they wanted. So the bigger, the better. The bigger the farms and land parcels, the more likely the county's initiative were to please upper-level governments. So what officials lacked at this time was an individual who was willing to be a kind of pioneer in this initiative. Who is going to sign up to be the first dahu when this has never been done before? So they schemed and they thought about this. And they settled on the man here to the right in this picture. I call him Zheng Feiyu. He's a local businessman and he's the head of the state authorized agricultural cooperative, which, as I just spoke about with Chin, are mostly Jada. Anyway, he's not very real. Anyway, so once again though, in this process, Yangchun and railing officials, they did not prioritize actual agricultural production in this decision to try to go after this guy to be the first dahu. How do we know this? It's because this guy has never actually done any farming before in his life. He had no farming experience. They chose him because his existing financial commitments in the township made him less likely to renege on his lease. They could constrain him via all of his entanglements. When this man, Zheng Feiyu, when he expressed reluctance, officials threatened him with penalties and fines and sought to entice him by offering support with his land rent as well as future rewards and agricultural collective status, which entitled him to further central government awards and tax breaks. In exchange, Zheng agreed to conspire with rural officials in their work to stage for inspectors the appearance of high-functioning modernized farms. County government head Fang's gamble, his gamble on all this paid off. When the central government began offering direct project funding and awards for agricultural modernization in 2008, Yangchun was one of the first recipients. So, but pressure to, and I've referred to this before under the red line scheme, pressure to expand the scale of agricultural modernization in Raylene increased in 2008 following the state's issuance of this red line policy. So Yangchun County officials, they began to receive requests from the city to free up, again, we can put that in air quotes, free up these land shares. So these requests were from the municipal government, and they were looking to, to increase their ability to undertake lucrative land development projects in their vicinity. So land consolidation and development work achieved this task by providing officials with justification to eliminate things like irrigation ponds, groves, gardens, and villagers' homes. So this was a justification, a rationalization for undertaking this major redevelopment work. For Yangchun officials, satisfying municipal officials meant not only meeting their budgets, but also receiving nominations for provincial and national awards as well as promotions. So there are multiple reasons why these local officials wanted to make these guys happy. If they did so, then they could better meet their goals. They could work their way up the promotion ladder, this kind of thing. So Yangchun County redoubled its modernization efforts in Raylene, including by offering financial incentives to attract new large-scale farmers. So it determined that those farming, again, we have these here, over 100 mu or 6.5 hectares, were eligible to receive 80 UN per mu in government subsidies, up to 100,000 UN in low-interest loans from the County Rural Credit Union, and the subsidized coverage of 50% of their insurance. And demand for farmland increased dramatically after members of the region's elite, they observed what Zhang Feiyu was able to achieve by virtue of kind of colluding with the local government. And the demand for farmland leasing increased following the 2008 rise in food prices and the state's guaranteed grain prices. And also the declines in profitability in other sectors of the economy in 2008. So again, here we see in 2008, as a result of the global financial crisis, and more commodities trading, rising grain prices. Okay. So again, we get back to this idea of the bigger the better. Ultimately, Raylene officials rewarded only 1/3 of initial land contracting bids. There was a lot of demand for this. But consistent with their beliefs, again, that larger farmers would better satisfy higher level officials, county and township officials prioritized investors who wanted to transfer over 1,000 mu, or 66.6 hectares. And they settled on these kinds of standards. A standard rent of 400 jin of rice or 200 grams of rice per mu on 5-year leases with 500 yuan per mu as a security deposit. So again, we see all this pressure to, we see all this pressure to expand these areas, but with little consideration for whether or not it's actually possible. All right. Okay. So there all this increasing pressure from the municipal government to free up this land for the red line trading and urban development. And so there were, again, Yangchun officials that began issuing these, in order to respond to this pressure, Yangchun officials then put pressure on the township government in the form of quotas. So they started asking the township government and village governments to free up more land. So we can see how this quota system worked in a certain sense. In the numbers we have, for example, this is what the county demanded, and this is what the county actually received. So they received, and here we see the difference. So as a result of these kinds of quotas that were passed down, much more land was freed up than was actually even required, because officials are trying so hard to make the officials above them happy. They're just doing more of this work than is even necessary to be done. Okay. Okay, I'll get to a few notes here about, say a few things about what happened here with large-scale farmers, and then I guess I have to wrap up. So I'm going to talk about this one large-scale farmer. His name is Chen Guofa. I met him in 2014, and he showed me around his new farming equipment and offices, and he posed for photos in front of his company sign, which is some signage here, and branded sacks of rice. And Chen had leased 800 mu, or about 53 hectares, in 2012 in the village of Fanqing, and he established a company producing what he referred to as high-quality varieties of rice and wheat. Chen co-owned a construction firm in the municipal capital, but after seeing the advertisement posted by the county government, he invested in agriculture. So the year prior, the year prior, Chen had taken a net loss of 100 yuan per mu on the land he used for rice and wheat farming, and had only a net income of about 10 yuan per mu on the land he used for early and late season rice. But he remained optimistic despite all these losses. The long-term outlook for grain is very good, he told me in 2014. The government knows this, and that is why it is supporting ventures like mine. He had hired a village production team leader, or duizhang, to help him with managing a team of agricultural workers, all of whom were current or former small-scale subsistence farmers. But when I returned in 2018 to Fanqing, I found that Chen and his company were gone. I located the duizhang who once worked as Chen's manager, and he told me that Chen had returned to the city the year prior. And here's what the duizhang says. He says, he thought he could turn a quick profit. He didn't understand a thing about farming, but the duizhang told me that was not Chen's only mistake. He trusted the officials. He believed them when they said that he could make a quick profit and that they would help him when he encountered problems, and he was wrong. So Chen's story is a common one among the mega dahu that predominated in the early phases of Raylene's agricultural modernization drive. Most like the first land contracting bidders in 2008 were municipal and county area business leaders or managers looking to diversify their investments in the aftermath of the financial crisis. Many devoted parts or all of their land to growing a single cash crop, only to see their investments fail as consumer tastes changed or the market became saturated. Many also believed that they were too politically important to fail, and that the central or lower level governments would provide them with financial assistance to sustain their operations. As I mentioned, as they struggled and departed the mega dahu, they fallowed sections or the entirety of their fields, leaving vacant land that had once been small-scale farmers, homes and the productive source of their livelihoods. These outcomes occurred despite some rural government support, including extension services and trainings by agricultural scientists. But the production team leader's statement also speaks to the problem of government officials among Raylene large-scale farmers. Along with the efforts to maximize the scale of production, Yangchun and Raylene officials worked to recruit mega dahu like Chen by telling them that they could viably follow the model of Raylene small-scale subsistence farmers and double crop early and late varieties of rice. However, Raylene's climate allows for only a 2-week window, usually falling during the year's most intense July heat, to complete the harvesting of early rice and the planting of late rice. Notoriously arduous even for small-scale subsistence farmers with 1% of Chen's arable land area, mega dahu quickly found this transition impossible. Natural disasters exposed a related problem. Dahu struggled to respond to events such as flooding in time to save their crops. Labor supervision at such scales also exacerbated these issues. Mega dahu drew on current and former small-scale subsistence farmers over 50 years old as seasonal workers. Managers, however, struggled to supervise workers, and with little personal or financial investment in the dahu's success, laborers simply dumped rather than spread buckets of seeds, fertilizers, and pesticides. By officials' own admission, the trainings by agricultural scientists were often abstract and irrelevant, and most dahu attended for only the free lunch provided. And I'll move on to end here with these last quotes. And then I'll go. Okay. So Raylene officials acknowledged the dahu's struggles. Like the production team leader, many blamed the dahu's short-sightedness, greed, and impatience. But many also suggested that the dahu struggles and the land waste that ensued do not matter. As Raylene's vice township head told me, some of the dahu feel we have lied to them and abandoned them. That is their view. My view is that many expected an easy way to make money and are unhappy when that did not happen. If you look, you see that some enterprising dahu have succeeded. The dahu complaining do not acknowledge this or the support we have given them. We must make new farmland and develop farmland. This is the county's request for us. In this work, we have succeeded. Of course, we want the dahu to succeed, but we have little influence in this matter. So I would say that, from a Foucauldian lens, to go back to our old buddy, the vice head employs individualizing and massifying logics to absolve himself of responsibility for and rationalize the dahu's financial losses and land waste. The failed dahu are themselves to blame for being less productive and efficient than their peers. The loss of land and financial capital is a justifiable and acceptable cost for achieving the broader infrastructural goals of modernization and land protection. Finally, in this work, the vice head and his colleagues are only functionaries with limited power to change the state's development direction. One more quote here. Raylene's head of agricultural extension, however, blamed the central government's policy, the effects of which show that the state is interested in creating the conditions to produce grain as the demand requires, but is all too willing to sacrifice farmers when they do not. He says, the central government talks a lot about agriculture, but doesn't care about farmers. It only cares about infrastructure. The problem is that there is no financial incentive to care about farmers. The central government spends a lot of money, but doesn't bother to see the impact. The money instead flows to the construction bosses. Everyone ignores this matter, and Dahu are left to live and die. Okay, I'm going to wrap up by just saying that I think that these findings echo some interesting kinds of research these days on what it means under conditions in which populism is growing. There is increasing worry, increasing damage, and concerns about climate change, just increasing inequality and more capital to invest. And what this means for investments. And what we see is people like Bill Gates and the wealthy increasingly buying up farmland, not so much as a productive investment, but as a kind of hedge on the future, the possibility that there's going to be some kind of, there'll be, what was the word I'm looking for? There'll be scarcity in the future. So this is sort of long-term investment with the thought that maybe 10, 20, 30 years down the line, this is all going to pay off when suddenly everyone needs this land. I would argue this kind of falls under a similar sort of way of understanding land use, which is to consider land as something that needs to be put aside in some sense for the future, given the unstable present and increasing anxiety about the future. But I'll say this, and this is truly what I'll say at the end, and that is that large-scale farmers are trying to push back in their own ways, as are small-scale farmers, to try to have more of a say in these matters. And I'm happy to talk about that. I'm happy to talk about this. I'm happy to talk about book project, anything else during the Q&A. And I just want to thank you all very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Ross. Now I invite my colleague, Nick Smith, to offer some commentary, and then we will open up for Q&A.
Thanks, Ross. Really interesting presentation, really interesting paper. So I had the advantage of reading the paper before, which, if you haven't had an opportunity, is really interesting, worth getting your hands on. Makes me really look forward to the book. Can't wait for the book. Hope it is rapidly on the way. And I thought, in reading the paper, one of the things that I found really valuable about it is this focus on large farmers, on the Dahu, right? Because it really is, what you find empirically really is contrary to what a lot of the common sense is out there. And I will admit, I am also sort of victim of this. My work in the past on villages has primarily looked at households, smallholders, the village, and I think many of us in the field have a tendency to sort of demonize the dragon heads and the large farmers, right, as in cahoots with local governments to buy up farmland. And I think it is really a useful contribution to sort of break that down and see what the challenges are that large farmers actually are facing. And so I found that really compelling. Where I think I have some difference is in terms of how you're sort of explaining what's going on. And that really fell into two categories for me. So, and the first one is, I need to admit at the outset that I am not of the Foucauldian persuasion. And so part of it is probably driven by sort of grappling with the Foucault. But one of the things that struck me in reading the paper is that I was genuinely unsurprised by the sort of behavior of the local officials that you observe, it was not at all surprising to me that local officials would be implementing government programs in overenthusiastic ways, in ways that are not entirely in keeping with their stated goals, and in ways that more or less disregard their effects on individual participants, and then turning around and touting them as successful, right? And all of that seems to me very in keeping with the sort of mobilizational politics and the politics of sort of campaigns in contemporary China, but also in Chinese history. And I noted that when you were sort of framing your intervention in terms of the sort of Foucauldian theory of biopolitics, and then you were arguing for that in contrast to a Marxist explanation or a Polanyian explanation. I don't even know that we need to go there, right? Because there are theories of the Chinese state and theories of Chinese governmentality that have been developed, in particular in political science, but also in sociology over, the last 40 years, that I think do a pretty good job of describing or explaining state behavior, right? And one of them that I think could be particularly useful in this circumstance is the understanding of fragmented authoritarianism, right? So one of the things that I kept sort of seeing a slippage in the paper is sort of the different fractions of the state, right? And wondering, like, is this actually what the central state meant to do when it launched this this policy? Is it actually trying to create land reservoirs to combat the uncertainty about scarcity in international markets? I'm sure the central state is concerned about food security. I mean, obviously they are. But do you have evidence of them setting out to do this? And then again, do you have evidence of local governments, either at the provincial or the municipal or the county scale, setting out to achieve this? Or from my experience, what I think is probably more likely, is this just like normal state dysfunction in China, where the local urban governments, local county governments are, doing things that the central state did not mean for them to do when they laid out the policy, or they're experimenting in ways that the central state is like, okay, you go do your experiment, and they're like, oh no, we don't actually want that. So yeah, curious to sort of hear more about that, and that's what you think Foucauldian biopolitics adds that we can't understand by sort of our existing understanding of how the Chinese state functions or does not. And then the second area where I had a little bit of a question about your interpretation is in terms of the periodization. So you seem to have a sense that things really started to change during the global financial crisis in 2008, which seems to be connected with now, we're not sure about global supply chains. Can we really rely on, agriculture coming in through the WTO? And of course, there are important things that change after 2008, especially in terms of land policy. And that's where we get the beginning of the separation of the three rights for rural land. But a lot of this in terms of agricultural modernization and the scaling up of agriculture starts well earlier than that, right? And we can trace back to the three rural problems in the 1990s, the realization that China is losing arable land in just huge amounts, right? And then this scramble to respond to that, leading to, it will not surprise you to hear me say this, urban-rural coordination in the early 2000s. And so So what about this is really the state responding to international food markets, and what of it is actually the state responding to the sort of internal logic of the inequity and dysfunction of the urban-rural system since 1978. There were a couple other things that I just found super interesting. I wanted to hear your thoughts about. One of the things I found really interesting was the urbanness of the large farmers. This is something that I have had a sense of too, that some of these policies are really introducing more urban capital into rural systems. And I wonder what your view is of what the effect of that urbanness or extra localness of capital has on local communities, agriculture, rural development. Like, does it matter that they're urban and not just, big, rich rural locals? And then, I was interested in the talk to hear you refer to the sort of modeling after US agriculture. I think that is, I have that sense too, that if it's not necessarily happening at the central level, although I think it is happening at the central level, certainly at the local level, there is this understanding of American agriculture as a model, right? We want big agribusiness, right? That's going to make Chinese agriculture strong. I find that deeply misguided and potentially impossible. And I saw in your evidence of it being really hard to do. And I'm wondering if you see that as like an inherent challenge of trying to scale up agriculture. Like, is it actually possible, given the Chinese circumstance and like the structure of rural economies and agriculture, is it possible to actually do this scaling up that the Chinese state has set out to do? Or are the problems that you've observed really just incidental to how local governments have kind of just like left large scale farmers out to dry, more or less? Is this a transitional mode, or is this a systemic issue that China really isn't going to be able to follow through on this policy priority? And then final question, I know that you've been back recently, and I was sort of curious to hear what that was like.
Thank you so much, Nick. But I think we only have 15 minutes left. So if you allow me, we collect a few questions from the audience so that you can respond together. Okay?
Thanks, Ross. Welcome from Berkeley, my alma mater, actually. Thanks. So I have one observation, one sort of a comment on your theoretical sort of part of the presentation, and finally I have a question. So 3 parts. First of all, it's interesting that I think it's very important for your research on this lesser known projects called farming or agriculture modernization project. The reason I say this is because it happened the same time, I think 2014, this winter 2014, I actually did a field research myself, was on land use, but it was not on this issue. And actually this day, I just got aware this project exists. But here's also I think there was a parallel project. I was in Jiangsu, Subei area. The project was actually called the Rural Urbanization Project. That's where the land use was very intensive. That's why that project well known, especially in Jiangsu, because of Li Keqiang. He first started that idea of urbanization. He did that in Jiangsu, experimented in Jiangsu. So it's about the same time you were there. I wonder if the parallel that also exists in other places like Anhui also, or whether that urbanization, because that has a lot to do with a lot of you talk about the red line. That's exactly what I find that in my field work at that winter. And one observation I have that time is that There was also a Dahu, right, a project. But the difference here is that the land there was not, it's arable, but it's very poor arable land. Subei is, not a whole lot of water, and so there's drought is often very windy in the winter, cold in winter. So, farming is, by that time, the farming was not something, I will come to this second point. So, is that there is no incentive for villagers to do farming anymore, right? So that's a demographic trend. I'll come to that point. So who is this Dahu? It's outsider. It's somebody it's a local, but who made out money outside by, I think, in real estate, of all things. Now he's coming back, doing a good thing, and he wanted to start this farm. Is actually, I talked to them, this project, they showed us that this project is a walnut tree. It's to produce walnut. So it's an economic kind of a crop, right? It's not really sort of green farming. And that's very interesting because that, tree needs less water. But the problem with that takes a longer time. You need at least 5 years. So we didn't quite ask about the land lease issue, which you mentioned is 5 years. So I have some question about that. So anyway, I just wanted to put that also has a lot to do with land. And that's also happened to be, in the same time as you're mentioning about the land, hoarding land, the land bank issues, because there was an incentive for the local government to use that project to hoard land, right? To take land away from that. But I wasn't quite aware of the other project, which is quite interesting. I assume that also had a lot to do with in the Anhui, where it's Jiangnan area, the grain farm arable land is really arable, right? It's a good land. So my second point is about your theoretical explanation. That I have, I kind of agree with Nick, but I think Nick is, I know Nick's work. So Nick actually kind of trying to be, he has a lot of it, you're also influenced by Foucault a little bit, governability, is that the word that you used? Governability, you used that one word, I thought it was so, anyway, that aside, so I'm a political scientist, so I would interpret this whole, what you're finding in a political economy point of view, right, from that approach. Let me try. So there's 3 actors involved in this: state, big farmer, the Dahu, right, the investor, and the villagers. Each of them have a different incentive, and that explains why they run into trouble. State, obviously, it's a local state, and I think Nick is right. There's also dynamic between local and central, but then let's just take a local state. Why they want that? Well, they want that for 2 reasons. One is for land use. It's because by integrate the farmland, at least in my field work in that project, urbanization, hoarding land is a big, for their other kind of projects, land. And then there's a personal incentive. I think you mentioned that, for zhengji, right? It's all the achievement for promotion, so that's an incentive for them. So they want to push this new project. Now, what about who want to invest in that, right? I mean, that's a really great question. The Dahu, who are the Dahu? And I did have that question, but you later explained that there's that Dahu, and it knows no farming. And that's not a surprise, because these people, you need money to invest in that. They're private. They're not, there's a kind of partly the one I asked about, the one that investor in this Subei area. So why he didn't want to invest? Why don't he want to show charity? He want to sort of 回报, to this local economy because he's from there. But he knows that won't make money, at least in short term, right? So he knows that. And then in my research, also we try to ask why the villagers were willing to put the land to this guy, lease the land. Well, because they're 老弱病残, and they have no, the incentive for them, at least in Subei area. So here's the question for you: is that in Anhui area, do the farmers still have very good incentive to keep land to themselves or not? So demographic is crucial here, because we know the hollow by 2014, there's a lot of hollow out. I mean, now it's probably getting worse. I mean, so the incentive for them to small plot is not any good anymore. They want to rent it out. They want to rent it to Dahu, right? I mean, so for them, there's incentive. So here you have 3 kinds of incentives. And they got in trouble. I think the big trouble is this land institution. Again, from political point of view, is this land lease problem. It's a short term. It's 5 years. Is that right? Is it 5 years? So that's very interesting. I didn't know that because eventually we didn't quite follow up on that project. So yeah, I mean that already gave a problem when I hear about it. Wow, 5 years. Who would, in the right mind? Or then again, maybe Anhui is abundant, is farm arable, so it make money, quick money in 5 years. But still, as an investor, you would have a long-term, horizon. So here I come to my third point about the question. So the question is, what happened to the Dahu? You said, oh, many of them failed. Then the question is, now I realize why life and die. The die is the Dahu. Then the question is that also you said there's 32% already China becomes modernized, integrated. Then to the state, that's a success. So the question is, literally, what happened to the Dahu? I mean, the land, is it back to the smaller pieces? Or they're kept? Who's keeping them? Who are the ones that instead of managing those big integrated modern pieces? So those are questions that are very important because when you say you live and die, and now I realize, oh, that die is Dahu, but villagers okay, state was okay, at least the state was fine, right? I mean, it's okay. They didn't die. They actually benefit from that. This succeeded. But your die, I see that is the Dahu, and the Dahu now. If let's use some Marxists, they're capitalists. I mean, they're the rational ones. If they want to get in trap, who cares? Literally, this is my non-Foucault kind of a critic. So what? They want to get into that trap, right? They should be rational. If they're not rational, so be it. Let it die. Sorry.
Okay, I will invite one student, two, and then Ross, you respond to everyone. Okay,
Sorry.
quick. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. Actually, my last two questions are the same as Professor Li's, but I have two additional questions. So first is kind of a comment. So Ross, I'm not sure because I'm fascinated by your work, but also what you did remind me of what Isa Ding did, like her book on the performative state. And I was wondering if you have considered that framework, how much of a performative governance the local state was doing. And the second question is, have you observed after the land consolidation if there's any change of interaction or social relations amongst the local villages and how they, for example, like the people who sell the land to the Dahu, how do they interact with each other? How do they interact with the Dahu? You mentioned some of them were being employed, but how is that employment relationship? And then the last question is, from a state capitalism framework, if this is truly incentivized by the central government, have you observed any trace, or if you haven't, then why not, has the central government mobilized any larger capitalism, especially state-owned enterprises, to participate in this project? So, yeah.
Thank you. I think yes, yeah, and then Ross. Okay.
Oh yeah, great. I mean, I think a lot of what I wanted to ask is covered. I guess just really quickly. I mean, I'm really interested in like how dispossession plays. What part it plays in your considerations. Whether stockpiling land would then change how we think about the dynamics of dispossession, or in this particular study, what happened to the displaced villagers? Like, were they left to die in a different way, a different institution? So yeah.
And Ross, you don't have to respond to every point, please. You have 5 minutes. Go ahead.
So many big questions. Thank you all very much.
I think you need to use the mic.
Oh, yes,
Thank you, please.
Yeah, I'm just, okay, I'm just making sure I get this down. Okay. Thank you all very much for those fantastic questions. Yeah, and wow, 5 minutes. Okay. No. Okay, I'll try. All right. So, but I'll start with Nick's questions. All these questions are so thoughtful and excellent. Really great. So, excuse me. Fragmented authoritarianism, theories of the Chinese state. I think it's a great question, and it's really hard for me to answer. I think that how to answer. In some ways, I think we can use both theories. I don't think they're at odds with each other. And I think that you're right, that this could provide a reasonable explanation for what we're seeing. And I will say that one of the reasons why I adopted a Foucauldian perspective is because I'm just lofty, maybe just by nature, and just just where I'm sort of drawn to naturally. And also, I like, maybe just by nature, I liked finding. It's not that I have any problem with studies that focus only on China. It's nothing like that. I also like the idea of trying to find more connections between what's happening in China and broader kinds of patterns. I like the idea of China, to the extent we can call something China studies, that it's not so insulated. We can find more points of connection. And I also like the challenge of trying to apply Foucault to China, because it's really, really hard. So I like the challenge of it. And it's controversial too, so, but I guess I'm just a masochist that way. But I also, when it comes to evidence about why I think this is compelling, a Foucauldian perspective and resource security, I think that these documents around 2008, 2009, like I had one quote from Wen Jiabao, I think I at least interpret them as speaking to real concerns from the state about what was happening at that time, and in particular the instability of grain markets, food supply, food security. This is a huge concern. I think that this instability was really weighing on them in the decisions that they were making. And I don't think it's a coincidence that around that same time, we start to see much more funding, much more of an explicit interest in trying to make this change to, for me, it's massive to say that this isn't just about creating an upstream or downstream kind of connection with small-scale farmers, but replacing those farmers with producers. That's a big, big change. But offering all this money around that time to bring that change about, the red line policy, I'm sure I can think of others too, that are right around the same time that I think are responding to this real concern about the dilemma that the state has found itself in, by virtue of the ways that I see, and again, maybe it's just my own inclination, but all of these different kinds of attempts to increase development in a short period of time that comes with costs, in this case, cost to rural land pollution and requisitioning rural land and moving workers off of the countryside, creating this food security dilemma. But I see this as the state. I'm trying to understand why the state did something and why this outcome was so odd. And I just see that the state was in a bind. How do you manage all of these? I'm trying to put myself in some sense in the head of someone like Wen Jiabao. How do you manage all of these really difficult problems? How do you keep development going while also creating a source of food security? So it's just my sort of take on why it is we end up in the situation with large-scale farmers that in some ways are stuck. They can't succeed because they have all of these forces in some respects working against them, including to the extent that they're encouraged to take on these investments in places that that's not feasible to do. And so I think we can certainly see all of these elements of again, fragmented authoritarianism at work, and I don't disagree with that. I just personally see that I think that there's a little bit more going on at a sort of macro system kind of level. That's just me, maybe. So that's that's where I see Foucault maybe coming into play. And as far as I was also interested in kind of wanting to bring him in because I think the quote from the extension agent, the head of extension, just kind of haunted me a little bit. Like to say that these folks have been left to live and die. I kept trying to honestly, I started writing about this 10 years ago, and I couldn't figure out what to do with that. Like I know there's something here, and I also couldn't figure out what to do with the Dahu. Like, well, how do I explain this? And I knew that something needed to be explained here because it didn't fit with this vision that I had. They weren't the bad guys, at least in total. And I would just maybe also in response a little bit to your great comment too, the Dahu circumstance is so complicated, and I know we're out of time, because we started with these more kind of capitalistic farmers, these large-scale farmers, like the one I gave an example of. But there was more of a switch around 2012 to these family farmers that were really just these guys were mostly they were former construction workers, a lot of truck drivers who were coming back home in their 50s because they were sort of in the informal workplace. They were kind of no longer viable. So they needed some place to go, and this was an opportunity for them. But for them to become dahu in this sense, even at lower scales like 200 mu, was still a huge investment, and they suffered. And even the people who are more capitalists, of course, when you get to know them, you see that they're also leveraging a lot of the capital they've earned, and they took major hits. And I think that they were misled in many cases by officials who had ulterior motives. But even there, you go upstream and you realize that they're responding to so much pressure to do something in such a short period of time that is really not in keeping with the best way to use land or the best way to use labor. And the people who suffered also were the villagers who were pushed off their land in many cases, who they didn't want to leave. And again, we could talk about this for hours, but they didn't want to leave. But they also were forced off their land to make way for these dahu that were not viable. So I mean, I don't mean to tell such a sad story. There's so much that came out of this that was good, but this was a kind of consistent theme that I saw. So who managed the farm? The big farms. The big farms. Well, it's what I've seen is more consolidation. There's more consolidation in the sense that, yeah. Now what we see in this township, there's two major large scale farmers, and they also are not viable. They are also in cahoots with the local government in order to, including the guy he's still there, he's still doing his thing. But there's another one who's even bigger, and he's also kind of got this operation that he's in collusion with the local government in order to create this scheme. But he wastes a ton of land and is well known around. So we see this more division between these big guys and then the family farmers that are struggling. Or the Jiating Nongchang.
I'm sorry, I have to cut you off. This has been such a rich presentation. Thank you so much, Ross, and thank you, Nick, for the excellent comments. And thank you, everyone, for being here this evening to engage in this dialogue. I know there are more questions and conversations to be had, but hopefully we will follow up. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.